Usually when we look at massive ancient structures, like, say, a towering stone dam holding back a river, there's this unconscious assumption of permanence.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. It's like the people living in the valley below it just go about their lives day after day, century after century, assuming that towering wall of stone is simply an unchangeable fact of nature.
Yeah.
It's been there before they were born, and it'll be there after they die.
Yeah, it creates this sense of environmental background noise. The structure just feels unshakable. And because of that, nobody really questions the shadow it casts.
Exactly. And it's comforting in a strange sort of restrictive way. I mean, the rules of the world are completely set. You don't have to figure out how to manage the river because the dam does it for you.
Right, until you look closely and, you notice a microscopic hairline fracture.
Yeah.
A tiny vulnerability in the concrete. And suddenly, in what feels like the blink of an eye to the people in the valley, the entire structure shatters. Millions of tons of water just wipe out the landscape in seconds.
It's terrifying. And that sudden explosive shatter, that moment the dam breaks, is exactly what we're digging into today. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Today we are exploring the psychological and philosophical mechanics of authority, rebellion, and freedom.
It's a heavy one today.
It is, because, have you ever wondered why people obey oppressive rules for generations, only to suddenly snap and tear the whole system down? Because as wild as it seems, it never actually happens as suddenly as it looks.
Far from it. The physics of that breaking point are usually building for decades, if not centuries.
Yeah. And to figure out the underlying mechanics of that breaking point, we're doing something a little different today. We are crossing streams.
Which is going to be really fun.
It really is. On one hand, we're pulling from this incredible documentary series called The Human Architecture of Hierarchy, which breaks down the historical birth of authority and the anatomy of real-world rebellions.
Specifically leaning into that 10th episode on why people finally rise up.
Right. But to really test these concepts, we're placing them right alongside a gritty sci-fi epic called San Vitae, The Awakening and its sequel.
Yeah, it's a brilliant juxtaposition. We are taking this highly fictional dystopian world of San Vitae, which is, a world full of crashed spaceships, godlike beings, and mutated powers, and using it as a laboratory to illustrate the very real historical and psychological truths of human submission and defiance.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we can understand why people rebel, we have to look at why they submit in the first place. Tearing down the dam implies you let someone build it over your head to begin with.
That is the crucial starting point.
Yeah.
If we look at the historical data, a foundational truth emerges. And that is, before there were laws or nations or standing armies, there were stories.
Stories.
Exactly. Historically, authority didn't rely on brute force alone. It relied heavily on divine myth. When early human civilizations needed order, they didn't just appoint an administrative manager.
Right, they didn't put out a job listing.
No, they created gods and then claimed those gods specifically chose the rulers.
And the sources are packed with vivid historical examples of this. You have the Egyptian pharaohs claiming literal divine blood flowing through their veins.
Yes.
You have Mesopotamian kings who insisted they received their laws and tablets directly from the hands of gods. Even the Japanese emperors historically traced their direct lineage back to the sun goddess, Amaterasu. The playbook is identical across wildly different cultures. It's basically, the universe demands this hierarchy, therefore you must obey.
Right, and we have to ask why that playbook works so flawlessly.
Yeah, why do we fall for it?
Well, psychologically speaking, human beings desperately crave predictability. We want meaning and order in an otherwise terrifying and chaotic universe. If you can frame an arbitrary social hierarchy as a cosmic necessity, you instantly reduce the population's existential anxiety.
Oh, I see where you're going. You make obedience feel not just physically safe, but morally righteous.
Exactly that. And there is a massive philosophical debate around this. Thinkers like Xenophanes in ancient Greece and later Ludwig Feuerbach in the 19th century argued a fascinating point. They basically said humans didn't make gods in the divine's image. Humans made gods in their own image to reflect their political and societal needs.
Wow.
Yeah. If horses could draw, Feuerbach essentially argued, their gods would look like horses. So the divine simply became a psychological technology for social control.
That is wild. Which actually brings us to Michel Foucault. Our synthesis documents bring up his concept of power, but, it can sound a bit academic. He says power is embedded into the architecture of society. Can we break down what that actually means on a daily level?
Yeah, let's ground it.
Mm.
Foucault's argument is that true power isn't just a king holding a sword to your neck.
Because that's exhausting.
Right, that requires way too much effort to maintain. True power is invisible. It's in the surveillance you know is happening, so you police yourself. It's in the mundane daily rituals like pledging allegiance to a flag or filing taxes a certain way that normalize the hierarchy.
So you don't even realize you're being controlled.
Exactly. When the architecture of society itself constantly reminds you of your place, the oppressive system simply feels like the natural weather of the world.
Oh, man. That is exactly what happens in the San Vitae universe. It is the ultimate fictional sandbox for Foucault's theory. You have this ruling class, the Sanitary Council, and they claim absolute divine authority over everyone else.
Yep.
They have all these sacred narratives and punishing rituals to justify their dominance. But the lore reveals the shocking truth. They aren't divine at all.
Not even slightly.
They were just native tribal leaders who were manipulated by a powerful off-worlder, Lotus's father. And their magical power, this holy substance called vitae that gives them dominion, isn't magic. It's literally just rogue nanotechnology leaking from a crashed spaceship called the Salvation.
It's so good. They built an entire religion around a technological accident. They used the myth of divine chosenness to play God, consolidate power, and maintain a brutal hierarchy where everyone else is treated as expendable.
It makes me think of a modern terms of service agreement on a new app or piece of software.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. We all just blindly scroll to the bottom and click accept without reading a single word. Why? Because the architecture of the digital world tells us we have to if we want to participate in modern life. We just submit to the system because questioning it feels like trying to break the internet.
Yeah, you just accept it as a given.
But this raises a huge question for me. If these systems of myth and power are so perfectly designed to keep us docile, how does the spell ever break? I mean, how do we go from scrolling past the terms of service to throwing the phone at the wall?
That is the pivotal question of human history, and it brings us right to the tipping point. The moment the illusion shatters, people finally rise up when the psychological and physical cost of staying silent outweighs the danger of defiance.
And the documentary, especially that 10th episode in the dossier, spends a significant amount of time breaking down the actual anatomy of a revolution. And the mechanics are gripping. Because as we established with the dam metaphor, revolutions look sudden, but they're anything but.
Absolutely.
Look at the Haitian Revolution. You had enslaved Africans rising up against one of the most powerful global empires of the time.
And that wasn't a spontaneous riot. The sheer, brutal desperation of their conditions forged an unbreakable necessity to act. But more importantly, they needed a mechanism to communicate and unify. They used voodoo ceremonies not just for spiritual comfort, but as a covert network to organize the oppressed right under the noses of their captors.
They used the architecture available to them.
Exactly.
Or look at the American Revolution. It wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. It was the slow, agonizing burn of taxation without representation, fueled by pamphlets that took Enlightenment philosophy and translated it into street-level anger.
And we see similar mechanics in the historical slave uprisings of Nat Turner and the Stono Rebellion. The documentary outlines that for a rebellion to actually ignite, it requires 3 very specific psychological shifts. It's not just about being angry. There is a formula to the tipping point.
Okay, walk me through that formula.
Well, the first shift is threshold theory. Basically, human risk assessment changes when the math of a crowd shifts. People act when they see enough other people act.
Okay.
Imagine you're in a terrible, abusive company meeting. Nobody wants to be the first person to stand up and yell at the boss because that person gets fired.
Obviously.
But if one brave person stands and then a second person joins them, suddenly the risk dilutes, the cost of joining drops. You hit a critical mass, a tipping point, and then everyone is standing.
That makes total sense. You need someone else to test the structural integrity of the dam first.
Precisely. The second shift is emotional contagion. We tend to think of rebellion as an action, but it is a collective emotion long before it becomes a kinetic event. Anger is contagious. Hope is contagious. Courage spreads through a population much like a virus. And the third shift is charismatic leadership. A revolution needs a focal point. It needs a person or a symbol who can articulate the vague, static frustration that everyone is feeling and turn it into directed movement.
And in San Vitae, the protagonist, Curium, physically embodies all 3 of those shifts. He is the ignition point.
Oh, completely.
He starts as a tortured conscript, essentially a slave to the Santery. He's dragged into an inquisitor vault. He's brutally beaten and abused. And in that vault, alone in the dark, he hits his absolute threshold. He realizes that obedience to the Santery or to the opposing pureblood zealots of Humanis La Luna simply guarantees his death.
Yeah, the cost of submission finally eclipses the terror of defying them.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. His defiance isn't just a personal awakening. As he transforms into a Sanite, this new, terrifyingly powerful evolution of the Vitae nanotech, his rebellion becomes literal biological contagion.
It's a fantastic parallel. His individual refusal to die quietly becomes the spark that infects the entire oppressive hierarchy. When fear loses its power over Kurian, it creates a ripple effect across the dystopian landscape, which actually brings up an incredibly profound historical debate that the documentary explores.
What's that?
Well, when we look at someone like Kurian or the leaders of historical revolutions, is rebellion a use, right? Or is it a duty?
Oh, that's a fascinating distinction. And it's important to look at both sides of that historically, just to understand the frameworks people use to justify tearing down the dam. I mean, on one side, you have Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
They argued that rebellion is a fundamental right.
Right.
Their logic was based on the social contract governments only exist by the consent of the governed. If a ruler breaks that contract and becomes a tyrant, the people have the inherent right to void the contract and overthrow them. In this view, rebellion is simply the legal remedy for tyranny.
And on the other side of that historical spectrum, you have philosophers, particularly the existentialists, who argue that resisting oppression is actually a moral duty. It's not just a legal loophole, it's an absolute obligation.
Meaning you have to do it.
Exactly. In their framework, rebellion isn't just about changing who collects the taxes. It is the ultimate assertion of human dignity. When a system structurally strips away your humanity, rebelling is the only possible way to restore your agency as a person.
I love how both frameworks arrive at the same destination. Whether viewed historically as a right to void a contract or a duty to reclaim your soul, rebellion is fundamentally the restoration of the self.
It is the ultimate act of drawing a boundary.
Which sounds incredibly triumphant. I mean, the music swells, the oppressors are torn down, the chains are broken, and you are standing victorious in the rubble of the old world. But, and here's the catch, what happens the day after the revolution? What happens when the dust settles and you realize the dam is gone? But now you have to figure out how to live in the mud.
Yeah, you've hit on the darkest part of the process. This is where the documentary pivots into the philosophies of freedom, because the uncomfortable truth is freedom is absolutely terrifying.
Wait, terrifying. Why?
Yes, because without a hierarchy to tell you what to do, what to value, what time to wake up, or who to be, you are suddenly faced with the crushing anxiety of total responsibility.
Ah, that brings up the Jean-Paul Sartre quote from the source materials. Perfectly captures this. He said, "We are condemned to be free." I've always loved that specific phrasing.
Powerful.
Condemned to it. It's not framed as a gift, it's framed as a burden. You have to author your own life from scratch.
Yeah.
And then you have the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who was actually born enslaved, teaching that true freedom isn't about external chains at all, it's about inner mastery. It's having the courage to stand alone in an empty room and confront yourself.
Exactly. And if we look at the psychological synthesis for San Vitae, Kurian's arc is a masterclass in this exact burden. It is not your standard triumphant hero's journey where he gets a sword and saves the kingdom. It is a grueling, agonizing psychological metamorphosis. When he finally escapes that inquisitor vault, he doesn't just walk out a free, well-adjusted man. He is entirely defined by his trauma.
He is a walking open wound.
Yeah. He's hypervigilant, he's constantly dissociating. His identity literally fractures into multiple selves just to survive the psychological pain of what was done to him. He develops this brutal demon persona to handle the violence, and he carries the psychic nanotech-induced memories of his former covenant Miyasuchi and her sister Rikuko. He is basically an amalgamation of ghosts.
Let's ground this for a second, because obviously we aren't dealing with sci-fi nanotech in our daily lives. But that psychological fracturing is incredibly real. Think about anyone who has survived a deeply toxic workplace or a severely abusive relationship.
Absolutely.
When you finally get out, when you finally rebel and leave, you don't just instantly bounce back to who you were before. You compartmentalize. You split yourself into the version that survived the abuse and the version trying to act normal at the grocery store.
That is a perfect translation of the concept, and it's why the synthesis documents apply Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of becoming to Kurian's journey. In Nietzsche's framework, suffering isn't a punishment from the universe, but it's a necessary tool. It's the fire required to bring down the old submissive self so that a completely new one can be forged. Kurian has to realize that the pain he endured isn't just damage, it's raw material.
It's like if your house burns down, you don't just sit in the ashes. But you also can't magically buy a new house. You have to take the scorched bricks from the rubble, clean them off, and draw a completely new floor plan.
Exactly. And the sources show how incredibly difficult that rebuilding process is when Kurian runs into his old friend, Tippin. This scene in the book is heartbreaking. Tippin felt abandoned when Kurian was taken by the Inquisitors, and because Tippin couldn't handle the absolute chaos of the unregulated wastes, the terror of total freedom, he joined the New Covenant.
The violent pureblood zealots.
Yes. Tippin essentially looked at the heavy burden of freedom, panicked, and actively chose the comfort of a brand new oppressive hierarchy. He traded one master for another because it felt safer than authoring his own life. Kurian looks at Tippin and realizes two things. He can't save his friend, and more importantly, Kurian cannot just fall back into his old comfortable role as a submissive follower.
So what does this all mean? Wait, I struggle with this whole concept. Are you saying we actually want to be oppressed?
Yeah.
Because looking at Tippin's choice, it seems completely irrational to look at a violent zealot cult and say, yes, sign me up. Why would anyone choose that over freedom?
Because certainty is a powerful narcotic. Being told exactly who your enemies are, exactly what your purpose is, and exactly what the rules are removes all the existential dread of having to figure it out yourself.
Wow.
It's irrational from the outside, but internally, it's a defense mechanism against the chaos of Sartre's condemnation to freedom. To avoid Tippin's fate, Kurian has to engage in what the synthesis calls humanistic actualization.
Using the scorched bricks to build a new floor plan.
Yes, he has to integrate his trauma, he has to accept those dark shadow selves like his demon persona, and consciously author a completely new integrated identity alongside his companion, Shrina. He has to reclaim his agency not just from the external oppressors, the Santeri, but from the internal ghosts of his own past.
It sounds like true freedom isn't a destination you conquer, plant a flag in, and then take a nap. It's a brutal, ongoing, daily psychological responsibility to maintain your own architecture.
And that brings us to the core synthesis of all these sources, the overarching thesis of both the historical documentary series and Kurian's fictional journey. The self is not something you find waiting for you under a rock. The self is created.
I love that.
Right. Whether you, the listener, are dealing with a literal systemic hierarchy in the real world, or you are battling sci-fi zealots like Kurian, or you are just fighting the invisible Foucault-style architectures of expectation in your own daily life, the rule remains exactly the same. Trauma does not define your identity. The structures of power around you do not dictate your destiny. It is your choice and your choice alone that shapes the future.
You have to make the terrifying choice to wake up and step out of the valley before the dam breaks on you.
Which leaves us with one final thought to consider. If all human authority is ultimately built on collective myths that we all just unconsciously agree to believe, and if rebellion is simply the act of waking up from a shared story that no longer serves us, what personal myth about your own limitations are you currently living under, completely unaware that you have the power to rewrite the script today?
That is a question worth sitting with. Think about the invisible dams in your own life. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Until then, keep questioning the architecture.